A few years ago, we actually got a council appropriation to explore and find out more about buried streams in the district. And so we put out a request for applications so that we would have a grantee execute the project to help us find out where more streams are buried in the district, other than some of the ones that we already knew. And it's a really complicated task because, over the history of the district's development, the development is what has caused the piping of the streams. Not everything has always been tracked. So there's many streams or waterways that might be piped on private property that were developed at times where people didn't need to necessarily get a permit to bury a stream, pre Clean Water Act type development. But what our grantee did was they put together a proposal that we found to be very compelling, where they were going to provide, and which they did provide, a GIS database of all the information that they've collected over historic streams that have been mapped throughout DC's sort of development history. They've explored opportunities to daylight streams around the district. So where can we take some of those buried pipes and bring them back up to the surface so that we can have natural flow of streams around the district? And then they also created this story map. And so what I'm going to do tonight is introduce you all to the project. But because the story map is so exhaustive with information, I'm not going to cover every single point in the story map. That's for you all to do after this session. Feel free to follow up with me. My contact information is actually on the story map itself at the very end. But before I get started in showing you the story map itself, I do want to say thanks to Strawn Environmental, who was our grantee. They did a fantastic job, and they worked with David Ramos, who was a consultant for them, who found a lot of the information, did a lot of the historic research. And so this is a great resource, not just for us at DOEE, when we're looking to execute projects, whether it's daylighting or better understanding the streams where they are and what they used to look like. But it's a resource for you all as residents of the district, as stakeholders in all the work that we do, so that you can find out what might be near you or what used to be near you. So with that, I'm going to get started and just run through sort of the key components of the story map itself. And then there's some mapping tools that both as a stream geek in DC and as a lifelong DC resident, I find myself looking at all the time now because it's such a great resource to see where streams used to be, not just near my house, but near your house too. So this might take a second to load. So what Strawn did is they pretty much put together a history of the district following periods when streams were mapped. And so you see across this tab, 1792 is the first map where we have really exhaustive survey work done of streams in DC, what's geographically DC. But it was even before we were actually the nation's capital. So it was a really interesting period. And as you scroll down in this, there's obviously narrative explaining the history of the district. But here's sort of the congressional act, dedicating the land, so Congress could create the federal district. But then this is the map itself that Andrew Ellicott put together. And what they've done is found some photos from nearby places from from the points on the overall map itself, so that we as the user can sort of learn the history of the district, but also have the pictures to see what it looked like. What is now the Anacostia River back then was known as the Eastern Branch. It was the eastern branch of the Potomac River because it was so big and wide and was full of fish, and it was a great resource for trade and commerce. And our work is to get it maybe not back to the commerce phase of the Anacostia River, but to get it back to be a fishable and swimmable river like it once was. And so we continue to go through looking at the Tiber Creek headwaters, Tiber Creek, which flows through the Noma neighborhood, which I'll come back to later, which is where DOE's world headquarters are. It was a stream that really starts at the old soldiers' home, is where the headwaters were, just above the old soldiers' home in northwest and a little bit in northeast DC. And it flowed down through what's now, the through the Bloomingdale neighborhood, through Eckington, and then down into Noma. And then it actually turns and heads out towards the Potomac River. And I just wanted to show you this little piece of information where it talked about how crystal clear and beautiful Tiber Creek was as a stream, flowing through what is now central DC, which is it's something amazing to think about. And then where the confluence was with the Potomac River is pretty much due south, maybe a little bit west of the president's house. So due west of where the White House is. And so that's where Tiber Creek entered into the Potomac River. And obviously that's now part of the mall, Constitution Avenue, those areas down there. I'll probably whenever I talk about a stream, I'll probably repeatedly call it my favorite stream, but Oxen Run is my favorite stream in DC and Ward 8. Great opportunity for restoration in the district. But they, were able to find some great history on Oxen Run that we'll see a little bit later in the map. And then the Bosch map in 1861 is by far the most detailed map that came about. Bosch was an engineer for the U.S. Coast Survey, and I'll show you a little bit later the maps that he put together, but it's really detailed about where the streams were in the district. You can see here, in this photo, where Tiber Creek also fed into the Washington City Canal that went pretty much right in front of the White House, where the reflecting pool is in front of the White House, and part of the canal went down to the Potomac River, and the other part went down south to the Anacostia River. And then where it flowed down, I'm going to scroll down because, again, you guys can flow through a lot of this, but I just want to hit on some key points since there is a lot to cover. Here's another great photo of Oxen Run, sort of overlooking where Oxen Run flows into the Potomac River, and I believe this was in 1915. But then, in the 1890s and early 1900s, as the district continued to develop and we all continued to use the toilet, we really needed to figure out a better way to get rid of the sewage. And I'm not saying we figured out a better way, but what they felt was a better way was to pipe a lot of our streams in the central part of the district, create a combined sewer system where the sewage from people's homes mixed with these streams that they piped, as well as some of the stormwater runoff from the streets, so that the water in the stream and the stormwater that flowed into it would help flush that sewage out of the neighborhoods, but into our local waterways. And so at the time, that was deemed better than what was happening, but it's still not a great way, and we're still trying to make amends with what happened there. But you can see the combined sewer system really is in the central part of the district, downtown, Capitol Hill, the Shaw neighborhood. I believe it goes all the way up a little bit in Lower Petworth as well. And this is the James Creek Canal. And I just wanted to highlight that because of the combined sewer system, but also the tidal flows that were going up and down, because the Anacostia River and Potomacs are tidal, James Creek got the name the foul stream of death. So take that what you will with it, but it showed that while they thought they were creating a better system, the combined sewer system was not good for our streams or waterways. And I will start skipping ahead because I want to get to some of the mapping things. The 1917 USGS mapping was the most recent stream mapping that we used for this project in terms, because it's historic streams. We do also integrate in current streams that we have mapped. This is down an arch canal that the photo was taken, I think, in 2012. Underneath Constitution Avenue. So that's what Tiber Creek pipe looks like underground right now. Sorry, it's going back A little bit screwy, the mouse. And again, all this is, for you all, and I think we'll put a link in the chat if we haven't done so yet so that you all can access this. This is a group of people crossing Oxen Run on a fallen tree. You probably could do that today because there are some trees that have fallen across Oxen Run. I'm not advising you to do it. I'm just saying you probably could. And then it talks about the dredging and filling of the Anacostia River. A lot of that dredge material was used to keep the river flowing, and so ships could go up and down it. That dredge material was then used to fill in the wetlands, which is now Anacostia Park, and it also was the creation of Kingman Island. And Doee is currently working on a restoration project out at Kingman Island to have outdoor classrooms, nature trails, a lot of good native vegetation. So it's a great restoration project that's in the planning phases right now.
And Josh, just to follow up on your comment, for those who would like to look along with Josh, in the chat box is a link to the story map. And you can also find that in the Eventbrite description, and whatever brought you here will also probably have that link as well.
And here's Oxen Run today, down in the bottom left. The upper portion of Oxen Run, which my mouse is on right now, is National Park Service land that does not have a concrete channel. But in the 1950s and 60s, a concrete channel was put in from 13th Street Southeast all the way down to South Capitol Street. And it was to help, since this is flood week, this channel was put in to reduce flooding in the surrounding neighborhood. And so that concrete or pipes in general help water flow more efficiently. If water is up on the surface, you can slow it down. You can water all the plants and native vegetation on the banks. But if it's in a pipe, it moves much faster. It moves much more efficiently. Similarly, they put in a concrete channel to try to get the water out of the neighborhood as fast as possible. And we are actually looking at, can we take that thing out while also reducing flood risk in the neighborhood. So what I'm going to do is skip to what I find to be a resource that you can definitely play with at home or at office, provided your supervisor doesn't see what you're doing. Or if it's me, I can do it because it's part of my day job. But what our grantee created through this GIS database was, this is what streams are like in the district now. Those are all the above ground streams in DC in blue. And this is what we used to have based on our 1793 map. So the bright blue is still what's above ground now. The red, it was what was mapped back in 1792. So I just sort of wanted to show you that. And then when you click on this link below, it says here, I'm not going to click on it because I already have it up. Can everyone see where it says 1200 First Street Northeast on this next window? Is that showing up for you guys? Brent and Josh? Anyone else?
Yes, that should.
Okay, so what this is a GIS map that anyone can use. But what I want to show you up here in the upper right-hand corner is there's different layers. So these are the stream maps that our grantee Strawn found. And so what you can do, I use 1200 First Street Northeast. That's DOE's offices. It's in where Tiber Creek was. So if you click on the Ellicott map, you can see where the stream was mapped in 1793. If you click on the Bosch layer, that's the red, you can see where Bosch mapped streams going through that neighborhood in 1793. I'm not going to do all of them. Very
cool.
But I just wanted you to so that you can, and this is the 1917 map. There was no stream in 1917 because at that point, the stream had been buried and piped. So there was no above ground stream, which is why if you click in this part of DC on the 1917 map, you're not going to get anything. But if you go back to 1886, you will get one because the stream had not been piped by 1886. So this is a really fun way to look and learn about where streams used to be. The one caveat I think that we always want to make clear for homeowners and business owners or property owners in general, just because this map says there was a stream right at this location doesn't mean that it was right there, because over time survey methods have changed, so the stream could have been 50 to 100 feet one way or the other. The other thing is we live in a developed city, so not only were streams piped, but earth has been moved around a lot, and that could also change how the water table flows or how water flows in any given neighborhood. We can change how watersheds are shaped and structured based on how we move earth around. And if we take a bunch of construction fill, if we take a bunch of clay and fill it in an area that used to be potentially a stream bed, that could move the stream underground somewhere else. So there's a lot of, really good information here, but just because there was a stream mapped here in, 1793 or 1861, it doesn't necessarily mean that there's a stream underneath your house right now. So I just wanted to put that out there. But this is a great resource. There's a bunch of different layers that you can work with, that are available to the public, so anyone can use these. The other thing that I'll do one more search so you guys can see. So we're going over to 22nd and Hartford Street Southeast. This is actually a site where we're going to be doing a stream restoration project called Stickfoot Branch. And and it's just another tool that we can use, that knowing where these streams were mapped in the past. Sometimes they're super accurate and sometimes they're not. I'm going to zoom out in a second once I click on the right stream layers. I think there's one more I need to click on. So this runs along Suitland Parkway. That's the curvy double-laned road, on your screen, and it goes down to the Anacostia River. But this red one, it it's definitely off by a couple hundred feet, because right where my mouse is now, that's up on a high hill. So you can do some ground truthing. Like we would not have moved enough earth to put to have a stream bed been here. So probably this stream was mapped a little bit further north than it actually was. So that's just something to keep in mind. Could there have been a stream underneath your house? Yes. Does there still mean there is one now? Maybe, probably not, but it's possible. And again, my contact information is all in here for you guys to follow up with me on. So what I'm now going to do is I'm going to go back to the story map, because I want to, what we just talked about was the past, but what's also really important is talking about the future. And where do we have daylighting opportunities? Where can we find streams that were underground and bring them back out, bring them back above ground, so that they can have cleaner water, so that we can have native plants growing along them, so that in some cases we could have fish and frogs and turtles back in our streams and neighborhoods where they haven't been for over 100 years. And so what I wanted to do, there's explainers in here about what groundwater is. There's some great explainers as well about why you might have water in your basement or not. And I think Josh is going to talk about the flooding in the district after I'm done. But this stuff looks at what you should think about at your house, how you can have how you can have water potentially in your basement, like I do. It could be poor drainage, which is what was the case for my house. Or there could be issues of flooding or pipes backing up. There's all sorts of different reasons that people might have water in your basement. It doesn't necessarily mean that there was a stream underneath your house. So you can take a look at all these reasons why there might be water in your basement. And but then I'm gonna get down to the actual stream mapping before or the daylighting before we run out of time. And of course, my internet's super slow right now. So what our so what our grantee Strong did is they basically found, 100 top candidates for where we could potentially daylight streams in the district. Where could we take streams out of pipes? And they looked for different types of characteristics. Is there water constantly coming out of the pipe? Because if there's water always coming out of the pipe, especially in dry times, that means it's probably a buried stream. Sometimes there's pipes that don't have stormwater pipes that don't have water coming out of them in dry times, which means it might not have been a buried stream. It could have, but it might not have been. And so what we did is we looked at Broad Branch, which is a project up in Northwest DC, where we daylighted a stream, a tributary of Broad Branch in 2014. And again, I'm gonna scroll through this for time's sake so that you guys can take a look back. Too fast for my own computer. So this is what the stream looked like. It had been put in a pipe, so that you can see there's a little depressional area. There probably historically was a stream that ran through here. This is a field, sort of where the stream used to be as well. That's Broad Branch Road off to the left. And then this is part of the project where there's a pipe underneath that large boulder. We daylit some of that, and we actually created a stream in that area where it had previously been piped. And so then this is sort of a before and after shot of that. That's after. Hold on, that's before. And you can see this house in the white off to the right. And if I scroll down a little bit or scroll up a little bit, you'll see it in the background. So it's that house right here. So you can see sort of the frame of reference, the house, the field, and then we brought a stream back up to the surface. It has a lot of good vegetation. And so what Strong did also is they highlighted 5 different projects where we could potentially daylight streams. And it was more, this is really conceptual. It doesn't mean we're going to do these, but it's ideas of where it could work. And really it's places where there's a lot of open space, because you don't want to daylight a stream right next to a house or a business, because it does present a new risk. But we did think that in some open spaces around the district where we knew there were pipe streams, and we're going to use Langston Golf Course as our one example for tonight, but we looked at 5 different sites. And as you can see, my computer is taking a very long time to load. See if I can click on it now. It's going to be super anticlimactic when it comes up, but it is cool. Oh, Brent, I told you I was going to have IT problems.
Not a problem. And if you continue to have them, I've caught up with you in the map, and I can screen share if you need.
All right, let me see if this will finally come up. But so this is Langston Golf Course, just to the west of the Anacostia River, to the west of the northern part of Kingman Island. I think my computer wants to do the right thing. It is just having a hard time making that decision. I do apologize for this, y'all.
Do you want me to take over? I've got it pulled up if you'd like.
Sure, yeah, if you want to share it, that's fine.
Sure. Can you stop sharing your screen?
Yes, give me 1 second.
Okay, you're live.
All right. So do you want to double click on the actual, yeah, the PDF? If you double click on that, it should enlarge. Yeah, and so what Strawn did is they created conceptual designs for us. So 15% designs, if it were full designs to go to construction, they'd be 100% designs. So this 15% design for Langston Golf Course just shows how we could daylight the stream there's two pipes, one a little bit to the north, one a little bit to the south. We could also capture some roadway runoff from the street just north of the golf course. But we could create this new feature in the golf course while also daylighting a stream. And so this is just a great way for us to see where are these opportunities and what's the potential for them. And then we can potentially work with property owners. The underlying property owner of Langston Golf Course is the National Park Service. So could we work with them to add this as not just a natural habitat feature, but potentially a feature to the golf course? I don't golf, so I don't know if this would really annoy golfers, but it's a conceptual level. So it's looking at opportunities. And we looked at a different site in Anacostia Park. We looked at a site at Old Soldiers Home, and then we looked at Foundry Branch as well. So we were looking around the district to see where these opportunities could be to daylight streams. And I think with that, my time is almost up, but I wanted you guys to see those key things. Of course, the story map that you all can look at. You can click on that link so you can start exploring where streams used to be in your neighborhoods. And then you can look at the maps for where we were looking at potential opportunities to daylight streams in the district. And while we just highlighted 5, we have a master list of over 100. We have current projects right now, the Stickfoot Branch Stream Restoration Project that's under designs now. We're going to daylight about 250 feet of stream for that project. Over at Fort DuPont, we might daylight 300 or 400 feet of stream that's in pipes presently. So there are smaller opportunities around DC, and when we have the opportunity to daylight streams, we will. And with that, I'm going to stop so that Josh can take over. And I think we'll have time at the end for questions.
Yes. And well, Josh, we've got a couple that are, Josh Birch, we've got a couple that are particular to you. So I'm going to fit those in right now, if you don't mind.
That's fine.
All right, great. So one of them in particular is, and there's two that overlap. So I want to see if I can. Okay. So one that I know off the top of my head, a question was, did the grantee create a video of the findings, a history that can be viewed online? And as part of this project, there is not a video component. However, I think we find that it's a very interactive tool to play around with. So one of the questions was, given the impact of global warming and climate change, as well as man-made changes to local topography, how concerned should we be about the drying of our streams and rivers? And I wonder if that's to our currently exposed streams and rivers, but do we have, I guess perhaps any base flow issues that we're experiencing with climate change in our existing streams?
We haven't pegged any of the base flow issues with existing streams directly to climate change. I mean, a lot of our streams are in such a degraded state because of the development that happens around them. And of course, that development plays into climate change. So yes, it's all related. But when we've developed our neighborhoods, and especially outside that central area, the combined sewer system, where the stormwater is separate from the sewage, that stormwater all goes in to a stream. And so when you think about the rainstorm we had in the middle of the day yesterday, all that water hits our rooftops, our sidewalks, and our roadways, and all other impervious surface that we have. And it goes right into the storm drain and then is discharged into a nearby water body. And what that's doing is, back in before development, the plants and the earth would absorb all of that rainwater and it would be spread out over the entire land. Now what it's done is it's put into a confined pipe, and that confined pipe discharges somewhere else. So we're depleting a lot of the earth of that natural infiltration. So our water table continues to go down, but then in rain events, that stormwater is like a fire hose and it creates a lot of erosion on our stream banks, but it also creates our streams to get lower and lower. So we have a lot of, as our streams get lower and lower, the water table gets lower and lower as well. And one
Yeah.
of the restoration techniques that we've been using is actually filling back in our stream channels. And when you fill back in the stream channels, we've done studies that we are bringing the water table back up. And when you bring the water table back up, that also helps bring back the native vegetation that should be in our riparian corridors. If you go to some of the streams east of the Anacostia River, which I'm most familiar with, you'll see right on top of a stream bank tulip poplars. And tulip poplars are upland forest trees, which means they don't like to have their roots wet. And the reason why they can live on top of stream banks east of the Anacostia is because the water table has gotten so low. And when we bring that water table up, we end up killing some tulip poplars. But what happens is then the sweet bay magnolias and the other sort of water loving trees come back. So we, in some ways, climate change definitely is a part of the what's happening, but it's the development that's driving the climate change, which is really driving how poor quality some of our streams have become.
All right, and I'll throw one more towards your way, and this is in particular just related to the process. And so, I'm going to put a few questions here together. Are grants paying for the daylighting of streams? And will the agency consider crowdfunding by the community to help pay for projects and programs? Although I would imagine that taxes are probably the ultimate in crowdfunding.
Yeah, no, I mean taxes are a good crowdfunding resource. We fund our projects through an array of grants and initiatives. There isn't just one. We get different grant funds from the Environmental Protection Agency to pay for stream restoration. We get, I think there's at least 3 different EPA grant sources that we use. Sometimes we get competitive grants from the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, which I know they supported a portion of the Linnaean project, which included also a lot of study related to stream restoration and water table elevations. So we definitely have different grant funding sources. In terms of crowdfunding for restoration projects, I'm going to stick with taxpayer dollars right now, and/or wetland mitigation funds that we get as well. But I don't want to get into, we want to make sure we're fixing the right streams for the district and not necessarily just ones where, someone sort of tells us to. We want to make sure we're going at it as an approach as what's best and what streams are most in need.
I got one more for you. So this is just relating to the communities where you do some of this daylighting. And just for what it's worth for the audience, I've seen Josh at work, and he takes the community engagement component of this very seriously. But the question is, so 2 parts. As you resurrect streams, how was the impacted community advised, or how was their input included in the process? And then perhaps the second part of that is, what is the immediate impact on the communities that experience? So the question is, what happens to communities that experience routine flooding where streams have been daylit? But anyway, let's first focus on the community engagement part of it, and we can get into the second part. And Josh Schnitzline, I appreciate your patience. We're going to get right to your presentation.
Yeah, I mean, so to us, like the community outreach component is super important. A lot of our stream restoration projects are driven by residents, not all of them, but a lot of them are driven by residents who are concerned about the state of the stream, and they do become advocates for stream restoration. And so, we work with residents to see if it makes sense to do a restoration project. Sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes streams might not look great, but it might not be worth us coming in with excavators and bulldozers to repair a stream. It can be a very invasive process. So we've only daylit 1 stream in the district thus far in my 12 years, and that was the Broad Branch project. And so we definitely worked with community members about it. What's really interesting, if you can remember that slide that we showed of Broad Branch, it was part of it was just a grass field, and then we restored it, and it had water in it and big boulders and a lot of vegetation. Some people in neighborhoods really just like grass fields. Some people really like boulders and streams. So sometimes with restoration, you're not going to make everybody happy. You want to consult with everybody. You want to make sure everybody knows what to expect. Because I think in the abstract, talking about, oh, we're going to restore a stream, really, who would be against that? But it's an invasive process. A lot of times we come in with bulldozers and excavators, and it's an inconvenience to residents who essentially have a construction site next to their home or in their neighborhood for a few months. Now the end product is really nice. So there is a little bit of sacrifice during the construction. But I think if we do our job and explain it to folks about what to expect, it definitely helps during construction. And then if people buy into the vision of what it's going to look like, and we do our job to make sure the end product is what we promised, I, 9 times out of 10, it works out really well. But if somebody wants a grass field and you want to put a stream there, you're not going to make that person happy.
Got it. Thank you. We're going to try to get to some of the other questions for Josh Birch at the end of this presentation here tonight. But for the moment now, we are going to pivot to our second topic for this evening, and that is to my good colleague here, Joshua Schnitzlein, and I'm going to pass him presenter responsibilities, and he can always let me know if he has any issues, but otherwise, Josh S., the floor is yours, good sir.
Hi, thank you, Brent. Can you hear me?
Loud and clear.
Great. Thank you, Josh. Josh Birch, and I hope to, for Josh's presentation, I hope to just talk a little bit about the history of flooding in the district, the types of flooding we receive, talk about the levee system. On Monday, we will have these recorded. On Monday, we had a presentation from Steve at the National Weather Service, specifically about flooding, the hydrology of flooding in the district. I'd encourage folks to listen to that presentation. I also gave an overview of the DC Flood Risk Viewer. I gave a demo of that for residents to be able to search their properties. Then I also was able to, we were able to have HCEMA, Kim from HCEMA presented on Alert DC. So I would encourage folks to, if they're interested more about flooding generally, to look at those presentations. I do have a PowerPoint, so I'm going to see if I can share my screen real quick. Okay, should be able to.
Nothing yet. There we go.
Okay.
Now we currently do see your notes.
Okay, that's no issue. I can take that off. I think that's one of the issues with hide presenter view. There we go.
There we go. There we go.
Okay, good. Okay, so as Brent mentioned, I work with Brent and Josh. I'm the National Flood Insurance Program Coordinator here at DOEE. So just for context, every state in the country, we fall within FEMA Region 3, so we have states like Maryland and Virginia. We all have National Flood Insurance Program Coordinators, and we work with FEMA to ensure that district residents have flood insurance. And so we coordinate outreach and mitigation activities. We also have a flood team here at DOEE. So we put together this history of flooding PowerPoint to discuss and to be able to share with residents or property developers or public officials just a little bit of a history. We also have a module coming out that we've been working on. It's about a 10-minute video that'll also be explaining this, and we're going to be having that on our website by the end of the week. So I would encourage people to check that out. That's going to be on our Flood Week website, and you can just Google DC Flood Week, and that'll come up. So as I mentioned, this PowerPoint will be the history of flooding in DC. Can go back. Okay, so I've been asked to do sort of 3 things tonight. First is to give a little background on the district's flood risk. The second is to talk about the levee system, and the third would be the water-related projects that you may or may not have heard about, and to show you the DC Flooders tool. So the district has a history of flooding, and I'm going to be talking first about how the city was built. This is a older map here. So when the exact location of the city was determined to be at the confluence of Potomac and Anacostia rivers, you can see in the south as they kind of bend up towards Maryland and Virginia. The natural shorelines and hydrology look very different than it does today. As Josh mentioned, that's important to keep in mind. The way that streams flow is not necessarily the way that we as planners or developers want things to go. You can look at any downtown area, you have Main Street and Water Street, and that's kind of the general thing in any small town in America. And people built their churches and their banks right on Main and Water. It's called water for a reason because it floods a lot. And so very important to keep in mind as we've been developing throughout the years. We didn't always, it's hard to tell if we had that in mind, 300 or 400 years ago with developments all across the world. But we certainly know now the impacts of flooding. We've seen that in recent years. And these colors here on this map show sort of a relief map, with the red being the highest areas. So you can see, we talk about DC potentially being a swamp for many reasons, but like quite literally, it kind of depresses there by the National Mall area. So zooming in here into the area we now call the monumental core. This is where you would go if you're sort of a tourist, or you wanted to check out the Lincoln Memorial and go down to Congress. You'll notice we have the East and West Potomac parks. They did not exist. And also, as Josh was talking about Tiber Creek, it extended into the city along what is sort of now called the Federal Triangle and Constitution Avenue in red there. Then, as many of you may or may not know, the city planning was turned over to Pierre Lafont. He designed the plan that we see here, which is still very much representing today's city. Lots of interesting things about the Lafont plan, but I want to focus on the interaction with water. So I'm sure by the Metro Center there you've heard of like Lafont Plaza, where actually is where sort of FEMA headquarters is. So the original Lafont plan hugged the shoreline of the Potomac and Anacostia. And as a note, at the time, the western edge of the mall was roughly at 17th Street. So Lafont even used the course of the Tiber Creek to introduce water into the city as part of the Washington City Canal, which is very interesting. And that's at the base of the Federal Triangle, as I mentioned before, along Constitution Avenue. So I have two images to show that it really did exist. Like, so if somebody mentions to you, hey, like, was there a Washington Canal? That is a true thing. It did, and it was integral to the initial plan of DC, which is really interesting. I mean, we have a very extended history with water in the city, as many other cities do. You think of like Boston, even on the East Coast, like Baltimore, that port type cities. So this is an actual city from the Capitol in 1863. You can see the Smithsonian Castle, Maryland Avenue on the left. The image here is an artist rendering from the Capitol in 1861. It just gives you a better sense of the canal sweeping across the city. But what it also does, and I think it really highlights the city's relationship with water, and I think it's really no surprise that the city has has problems with flooding when you look at an image like this. So as we've been developing and developing and developing, the water doesn't care about that. It's nature. That flooding is an act of nature, not an act of us developers. And so we can try as much as we'd like to develop around that, and we certainly do today with regulations in place. You go to, say, you vacation at at the Outer Banks, and you look around and see all the homes up on piers, because there it's certainly much more coastal. But it's very interesting to keep in mind. As we've been developing as a city, we do have regulations in place, but it's still not getting around that central fact that we do have this inherent relationship with water. So before we talk about today's flood risk, which I really encourage you to go back to Monday's meeting, and Steve from National Weather Service really went into that further. But what to do about it? We need to talk a little bit about the different types of flooding. And so very briefly, you can see this map here. This is our floodplain. So this is our technical regulated floodplain. FEMA has this in place. This is what we regulate to. So if you have buildings here, like new construction, and if they're in this floodplain here, which is really, you can think of the floodplain, you have doesn't matter how big or small the waterway is, it's got to go somewhere, and we see that consistently in the country now, most recently in Texas kind of happening now, these overflows. So the floodplain is really just the extent of where that natural flood water is going to spread out to. The problem is when you're in an urban area, particularly as built out as the district is, DOE has done a great job and the district's done a great job of implementing green infrastructure to soak some of that up. We have our sewer systems, but depending on how large the flood is, with all of the asphalt and things like that in an urban area, it's got to go somewhere. And so it's going to just, naturally go where it is. As I mentioned before, the water doesn't care if there's a fancy new high rise there, it's going to flood. And so we do our best job to regulate for that and prepare it the best that we can. So the first type of, I should show too, this is another map of the structures. So you can see we have quite a bit, particularly in the Watts Branch area to the northeast of the map there. But all the images are red are the buildings in the current regulated area. And then we also have our proposed regulated area in our new hazard rules, which if you just Google DC DOE flood hazard rules, we have some really great presentations and information about, what all that looks like. I know on Monday there were some questions about, what do the regulations look like for flooding in the district, with property development. And there's a dedicated page for that that I forgot to mention on Monday. And so if you're looking at this entire area, the totality of this with condos, businesses, single family homes, with the 500-year and 100-year included, talk about that a little bit later. Essentially, you can think of the 100 years as a 1% chance. So like there's a 1% chance each year. It's not necessarily the case that it's going to flood once every 100 years, but each year there's a 1% chance. And then the 500-year is basically even half of that, 0.02. So the thing to keep in mind here is that we do have a lot of properties in the floodplain. We have close to about anywhere from 2,500 to 3,000 properties in the totality of the floodplain, and we're developing that. You submit a permit to DCRA, which is our building code official. It goes kind of on the conveyor belt from A to B. It gets if it's in the floodplain, the regulated area, it gets a check mark. And it goes to DOE. We do the review on that to make sure it meets our regulations, and then we kick it back to DCRA for the approval chain for the development. So the first type of flooding that we have in the district is river flooding. That's heavy rains, snow melt in the 14,000 square mile Potomac River watershed. Very important to keep in mind that there's externalities involved here, similar to pollution and air quality. This isn't just a DC thing. This is a Maryland, Virginia. We have a watershed. It's really important to keep that in mind. So the Potomac River watershed can cause flooding hours or days later in downtown DC, which is why I showed that sort of depressed map with the red contours there, showing how we kind of depress as we get into the National Mall area. And that's just sort of what we have. That's what we're dealing with. And just for some perspective, showing you the watershed, anything, anytime there's a drop of rain that falls upstream, to the left of the red shape of DC there, eventually it's going to make its way to the District of Columbia. I know I got to kind of cut this short for time here, but I just wanted to show one of the first documented floods in the city, which happened to be a river flood, was in 1889. This photo shows flooding of Pennsylvania Avenue between 2nd and 10th. And you see the horse in the background there. The most notable flood of this type was the Great Flood of 1936. And the storm, there was a snow melt here. It caused the flood to actually have a significant amount of devastation along the entire Northeast, including areas like Pittsburgh. As an interesting side note, at the time of this flood, Congress was less than a week away from debating the Flood Control Act of 1936, with floodwaters, quite literally visible from the Capitol, which you can see on the top right. So it's no surprise that act was passed 3 months later in June, and it authorized levee systems to be constructed in DC as well as other areas. So despite all the protections, the city still experiences river flooding today. In this case, heavy rains and snow melt from the watershed caused flooding in Washington Harbor area and Georgetown. And there's a lot of articles in the Washington Post about that you can read about. Again, I know I'm a little pressed for time here, so I'm going to go through this rather quickly. Coastal flooding, the second type of flooding we have. So the first is river. Second, you can think of as coastal. So that is, tidal or storm surge flooding. It's a result of the Potomac River's connection to the Chesapeake Bay and ultimately the Atlantic Ocean. And even though we're seemingly far away from the ocean, the Potomac and Anacostia rivers are both tidal. And the difference between high and low tides is about 3 feet. Flooding of this type occurs when there is a tropical storm or hurricane that pushes the water up the Potomac River and into the city. This is an example of coastal flooding and a storm surge from Hurricane Isabel, 2003. Was taken before high tide, so the water actually got even closer to the bridge deck of Coots Memorial Bridge. Normally, you're able to see quite a bit of the bridge supports. This is the same flood, but in Alexandria, because of the region's topography, they got flooded a little bit more. You can see the gauge there, 6. It's about 5.5 feet. And of course, another aspect of the tidal flooding is sea level rise. So we can get flooding during high tides, and that's exactly what you see here. There's no storm involved, and we often call these sunny day or sort of nuisance floods. Interior flooding. So that would be the third type of flooding. So we have this regulated floodplain area. We know where the waterways are. We know where the water kind of needs to go, but what about the interior flooding? It occurs when the local heavy rains overwhelm the stormwater system itself. So all the ability of the water to kind of naturally push out, through all that infrastructure, through all that, asphalt and concrete and all that sort of stuff through the sewer system, if it's not able to be controlled well, just given, and oftentimes just kind of given by, the amount of flooding that happens, they'll have ponding on streets. And the local topography, as I mentioned before, that certainly plays a large role. You have here in the arrows, like the Bloomingdale neighborhood, you can see that's removed from the actual floodwaters itself, but we're still getting flooding there. You're seeing, Federal Triangle, as I mentioned before, Constitution Avenue being one of the lowest points in the city. There's a lot of storm water that tends to funnel towards that area. This is a map done by the DC Silver Jackets, which is an interagency flood team, federal and district partners. We're currently in the district working on a capital-funded project to map all of this interior flooding. But we did a preliminary look at that, and you can see the grids here, most flooding in red, and we have some darker flooding in blue. It doesn't quite jive with this simple flood map. It's kind of can get anywhere in the city, and that's really important to keep in mind. That's why we encourage folks outside of that regulated floodplain area to get flood insurance if they can. It's substantially cheaper. So very important to keep in mind. So an example of 2006, sort of exactly what happened. Here's a photo in that Federal Triangle area. I should note here that the water surface elevation on the Potomac was normal. So this water did not come from the river, but it was simply a result of heavy rains. And this flood caused millions of dollars of damage to federal facilities like IRS, DOJ buildings. You can see what the heavy rain did to the National Archives Theater, which sadly had to be had just been renovated. We actually yesterday we did a test installation as part of Flood Week for the archives, and we have some. Brent can talk more about that, but we have some graphics of that, and it's really interesting what can be done with the protection barriers. This is a residential area in Bloomingdale. You can see, as I mentioned, as the arrows in the last couple slides showed, not in the floodplain, but still flooding due to that interior flooding. So 2016, we have just a matter of minutes, elevators turned into waterfalls and the metro access turned into a bathtub, essentially. Really stunning photos. I took these photos September 10th of last year. It's called sort of a cloudburst flood. We had very intense rainfall. It wasn't like a Ellicott City or a Houston flood where it was millions and millions of dollars of damage, but I just rode my bike out here, and this was the flooding that occurred. We had in residential areas, but you can sort of see nobody was sort of expecting this on September 10th of last year, and it happened anyway. And there's pretty striking photos. So now that we've got the background, I just wanted to spend a minute or two on what types of flooding mean and how we can prepare. And so this is so it's like, why am I showing all the way up here in Cumberland around West Virginia? This is a result of the watershed as a whole, as I mentioned before. So there's stream gauges all along the Potomac River and other tributaries up in the watershed. And we can see water levels rise on those gauges. And we know that water will take 1 or 2 days to arrive in DC. So this is showing the location of the stream gauge in Paw Paw, West Virginia. It's quite a ways from DC. And we have gauges further upstream and downstream that we use to predict the flow of water in DC. So really interesting. It's sort of a systems approach, if you can think. It's very systemic in nature. So during hurricane season, we're all familiar with this, hurricane season. So we'll be getting warnings about storm surge, and the National Weather Service will update the prediction accordingly that you saw on the previous page. In both cases, whether it comes as expected or not, north or south, I wanted to show what it looks like. So, we have down the river or up the Chesapeake Bay, the National Weather Service is going to update the predictions to show how it will change. So this is an example of a stream gauge, and you can go on our DC flood risk viewer. You just Google DC flood risk viewer. We actually have in live from Georgetown and then Southwest are gauges. And you can see here what the real-time per day stream gauge is going to be like. But for the interior flooding, so as I mentioned, we have river, coastal, interior. Those are the big three. There is no warning, as I showed in some of those other images. You can't plan for an interior flood. This is a photo of flooding that occurred in the evening of May 27, 2018 in Ellicott City. I'm sure we're all familiar with that. They got hit by 2 whoppers. I think the FEMA projections of just people that got FEMA claims was about $5 million for one of those floods. And so we're talking about basements being blown out. We're talking about homes that were built probably before regulations came into place. So their basements were not evacuated, or they were not elevated to the proper manner, which in 1830 or, 1920, we just didn't have that wherewithal. We probably knew about it, but we didn't have those proper regulations. So very important to keep in mind. I got to go a little quick here. I know we're at the hour. So this is a slide from May 27th, 2018. It's a National Weather Service forecast for the day of that Ellicott City flood. This isn't a knock on the Weather Service at all. They did it well to notify the region that was a possibility. But I'm showing this because when it comes to interior flooding, we know there's a moisture in the air and it will come down somewhere, but just don't know where. And just think, if that storm cell were just 40 miles south, which on a thunderstorm scale really is nothing, we could have seen devastation right here in DC. And so that's why it's important. People say, well, we have these 100-year, 500-year floods. We have this nuisance flooding, DC, sure, we've gotten hit in the past. We have examples of that. But just because we didn't get it yesterday does not mean we will get it today. And, we have this sort of, are we going to be proactive or reactive? And our office takes a stance we want to be as proactive as possible in looking at these sort of things, particularly because it's a regional issue. So very, very quickly, I can go more into depth in this usually, but given time, I'm just going to talk about the levee very briefly. We have a levee system in DC. You can see here, you might be thinking to yourself, I thought the levee took care of all of this. A levee is essentially, you can see here, it's basically a real big flood wall that is super duper fancy and very expensive. So this is a photo of the recently completed 17th Street levee closure, which is part of the levee system. I assume most of you know DC has a levee system. You've probably even driven past this. Maybe you haven't even you've seen it but didn't know what it was, but maybe didn't know about all the components. And so this is it. We have quite a bit all around the district. And to explain it, I'm going to use a slide from GSA. So this is like the West Potomac Park levee system, and it has a couple components, and this is like north of the Lincoln right here. And so here's part of what it looks like. This is a view of the north side of the reflecting pool. The cool thing is the berm to your left just looks like a landscape feature, but it's actually part of the levee system that protects DC from flooding. This was constructed in 1936 after the congressional act that I talked about. And it's just one part and also a closure that needs to happen at the 17th Street. So I'm sure everyone has walked by here. You know, I used to, run there quite a bit, and you might not have known that. Here's 1942. It wasn't like it was today. In 1942, we had sandbags there. That was the preferred technology. Here's 2003 as we prep for Hurricane Isabel. You can see even 60 years later, we were still using the same technology for the temporary closure. Of course, this isn't DC, but Hurricane Katrina, the Army Corps began to reevaluate its levee systems around the nation. We all know what happened there, including here in DC. The reevaluation happened. So in 2007, when they finished their analysis of the Potomac Park levee system, they decided that this temporary sandbag closure was no longer a reliable flood control measure, and the levee system was decertified. So this is a big deal because it also meant that people that were previously protected by the levee system and didn't have to pay flood insurance, they now had to pay for insurance through no fault of their own. And according to FEMA, once you decertify a levee, it basically pretends that it doesn't exist and water will go right through. It took a while, but eventually we worked out the design and funding and ended up with this levee enclosure. And is now fully functional and tested every few years. And so through Flood Week this week, we've been doing various demonstrations. We actually have one Thursday, a live viewing of Peninsula 88's, not necessarily levee system, but their flood barrier technology for folks to check out. And I'm really glossing over the amount of effort that it took. There was a lot of agencies involved, federal and local. As you can tell, it also took 8 years to be built. And I have a whole other 30-minute presentation on the levee construction, which just shows how complicated it is. I'm almost at the end of my time. I'm over, but real quick, this is what it looks like when it's, here being closed. Here's a map to explain the benefit of the levee. So out of all those components I talked about, the area in orange would flood, but the levee is only so high. So it's important that everyone here understand that there's still a residual risk if the flood is greater than what the levee can stand. And federal triangle areas in orange will flood. Also want to point out that even with the levee installed, a 100-year event, the areas in light brown and orange will flood no matter what. And so I'm sure people have biked around, as you go down the point there. Now to make things even more complicated, I'm going to show you a different map. There's a lot of things going on here, but what I want you to focus on here is the red shaded area. This area, which includes Federal Triangle, is protected by the levee and protected from a 1% annual chance riverine or coastal flood, but it's still vulnerable to that 1% or 100-year interior flood. So remember those three different floods I talked about, riverine, coastal, and interior. What I'm saying is if the flooding is to overflow the Potomac River banks, then the levee protects us. However, if it's an interior flood, which is just a lot of rain, then the levee does not help. So put another way, when you stand in Federal Triangle, even with the levee system, you have a 1% chance every year of being flooded due to interior flooding. Very quickly, I'm sure people have wondered about DC Water's construction with tunnels. So tunnels are used to reduce CSOs, which are the combined sewage overflows in the combined sewer system during dry weather. So in heavy rains, the volume is too much. And so the way the system was originally built meant that the excess mixture would go directly into the river, which is gross. And EPA thought it was gross and bad for health and required DC government and DC Water to sign a decree that they will reduce the number of CSOs in the district's water bodies by 96%. To do that, they're proposing giant tunnels. And if you want to stick with this very basic diagram, they're going to make the bottom tunnel way bigger so that it can hold more stuff and less would go to the river. So things to point out of tunnels is about water quality. So instead of dirty water going to a river, it will be stored and then treated. Its required purpose is not about flooding. So there's a lot more to go over about this. I know I'm over time, so I'll just show these pictures. Real quick, what tools can I use to prepare? I gave a live demo on Monday that's been recorded for the flood inundation maps. If you just Google DC Flood Risk Viewer, you can see here we have a forecast, flood risk, and social media section. You can search any property in the district. It'll let you know if it's in that blue 100-year area or if it's in the 500-year orange area. So really powerful to check out. That was developed by Visonomy, who is our partner on that. I'm happy to now turn it back over to Josh and Brent for questions. I do want to mention that Nick Bernard, who is my supervisor and boss, he designed the materials for this presentation. I wanted to give him the credit for that. Fortunately, he was not able to present today, but thank you for the time. And I will drop my email in the box if I can't get to your questions, or if we run over time, please email me, and I'm happy to answer.
Thank you, Josh, so much for that presentation. Very much appreciate it. Josh, I'm just so Josh Schnitzline, in your WebEx viewer, can you see the Q&A box? Do you see that as an option for you to view?
Yes, looks like kind of wonky, but yeah, yep, I got
so
it.
scroll down all the way to the bottom, and there's a series of questions that are particularly aimed at you. And I'll start with Carmen Bolt's question. Does DOE collaborate/partner with DC Water to address the flood risk of DC's most vulnerable communities in particular? I'm just thinking about how low-income communities are not necessarily able to purchase flood insurance, undertake flood mitigation efforts, etc. Are there any specific programs, plans for how to lessen the impact of interior flooding?
So I know, I don't want to speak directly for DC Water. I know that DC Water did have a program for, say that you had sewage backup and you had basement flooded in the September 10th flooding in particular. I know they did have a rebate program in place. I don't want to speak directly for that. I know that, if you Google that, their page will show up for that. We've been thinking in our office a lot about, it's really an equity issue. A lot of our floodplains are, in areas like Watts Branch, where we have our vulnerable population exists. And so we have been doing a lot of thinking as an agency and as a flood team about how to address that. There's a lot of ways we can look at that. There's different flood insurance models out there, like parametric, where it's a community-based flood. So instead of it being individualized, it goes where if the flood hits a certain level, there's an immediate payout. We're actually collaborating right now with UPenn's Wharton School on that. We have been looking at like direct subsidy-based programs that we could potentially look at. We haven't done anything with that yet. But yes, that's a very big effort for our office, looking at equity. We're actually sending out later in a week or two, we're going to be sending out brochures to every single person in the 100-year floodplain and I believe 500 with information on that of how to get flood insurance, different ways to mitigate one's property. Unfortunately, fortunately and unfortunately, I think fortunately the district has not been hit by a whopper of a flood, which is great. However, when it comes to mitigation grants and those sort of things, we have to do our benefit costs for grants based on projected flooding as opposed to past flooding. So, if you're in Pennsylvania or something like that, or Virginia, and you get a massive storm that hits, FEMA has a quota, and say it's $3 million for the district. If a flood gets hit with that, then you open up and you get mitigation options and relief. So we're trying to look at how can we do that now without having experienced that monster flood that has hit us. And it's a very interesting thing that we've been pursuing. And our office is actively pursuing mitigation programs to help retrofit properties. We're trying to work currently to make the funding fall in line with that. Interior flooding, as I mentioned before, we're currently looking at doing it. We actually have funding. We have funding to do it, and we're going through the contracting process currently to do an interior flooding model. So we can actually model, like we have the 100-year, 500-year model. We're going to be able to model that interior flooding, as I showed on my presentation, that kind of the Bloomingdale area, those sort of areas that have been hit with more of that interior nuanced flooding. That will now be mapped. Obviously, with government, it takes a while, but we are currently in the process for procurement with that effort.
Excellent answer. And one more question for you, Josh S. Besides flood insurance, is there any available resources for victims of interior flooding? And along those lines, is there outreach occurring in the high-risk interior flood areas to inform residents to get flood insurance?
Our office has made a big push for that recently, and we've heard that. We have a sort of we have communication with HCEMA, their office, the Department of Emergency Management for the district. They field those questions, and as I mentioned, I know DC Water had programs I know there is flood insurance to acquire. Like, so if you have interior flooding and you're outside of the floodplain, if you were to receive flood insurance, it's substantially cheaper than if it's mandated if you have a mortgage. That's one of the #1 priorities for our office. We recently completed an internal floodplain management plan, and one of the major issues was interior flooding as well as equity. So, you know, as with government, oftentimes and looking and reviewing these solutions, things do take time, but that is, we've seen and recognized that interior flooding is more common than, you know, like a Houston flood or something like that, or what they experienced in Louisiana. That's certainly a possibility for DC. That would be the worst case scenario, but we are getting more and more of this interior flooding and this new nuisance, I want to call it, sort of flooding. And so our office has been looking at ways to address that. More recently, in terms of immediate relief programs for folks with interior flooding, that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to get programs in place to be able to help and to do that. And I'm more than happy if someone wants to email me directly on that. I'm more than happy to speak with you. I dropped my email in the chat.
Well, thank you, gentlemen, very much. I want to thank all those who participated so much for your time and for engaging. We really appreciate that attendance really held steady throughout the event. So to my fellow presenters, Josh and Josh, thank you, gentlemen, very much. We are going to close out the event there, but wanted to just thank you all, and again, encourage you to join us for the rest of our Flood Week events. And those are starting tomorrow morning at 10 a.m. for a flood barrier technologies demonstration, and then at 4 p.m. tomorrow for a flood insurance forum. All of these materials will be available starting next week at ready.dc.gov/floodweek. So with that, I want to wish
Thanks,
you all
Brent. Happy anniversary.
Hey, cheers. Thank you. I do have to go. All the best, everyone. Have a great night.